Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to this month's episode of Don't Get Rusty. And as you can see from our title slide, we're doing Look Ma, no engine, more pilot, less power, soaring. So we're going to talk about gliders today and sailplanes, and in fact, even the difference between them. So super excited to talk about this topic, and we've got a special guest that we'll introduce here in just a moment. But before we get to the details, let's just do some quick housekeeping. Remember, if you are on a PC or a computer of some sort, your menu should look something like this, and that's your attendee control panel. And the biggest thing to interact with us is you're going to want to hit that question label there. It looks like a little cartoon bubble with a question mark in it. Type your question in the box and then make sure that you hit send, because if you don't hit the send, we won't see it. So make sure you hit that send button. If you're on a tablet of some sort, then your menu is going to look a little bit different, more like this. So look for that question mark again. And then when you tap on it, it should pop open the box, type your question, and then make sure you hit the send button. So that way we'll see it. So don't forget, hit the send button. As always, my name is Chris Moser. I'm the Senior Director of Flight Training Education here at AOPA. I am a CFI and was a teacher for a long time. And I'm glad to be here with you as always. And I'm really excited to introduce our special guest, Scott Manley, who's here with us, longtime educator, longtime CFIG, which stands for Glider CFI. Scott, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, the picture I'm using, if you've ever noticed, whenever they have pictures of professional pictures, they always show somebody who's they put up a picture who's much younger than they always were. So I just took that to an extreme. Yeah, primarily. So I have about 50 years of teaching experience. I was a teacher before I was a pilot, and so I always list my teaching credentials first because from a flight instructor's perspective, that's what's important. I do most of my simulation, most of my training now in using flight simulation software, and but I'm a qualified commercial certificate in airplane, single engine, land, and glider.
Cool. Well, thanks. We're really excited to have you here, Scott. So I wanted to bring somebody on board when we were going to talk about gliders. Even though I've done my glider rating and things like that, I am by far not even remotely an expert. So we're glad to have you on. And he was the first person I thought of when I said, we're going to do a glider episode. Let me see if Scott's available. So, all right, Dan.
Good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast, morning to those west of us. Happy to be on today. I get to work with Chris and Steven in the Flight Training Initiative, support the Rusty Pilots Initiative, the Flying Clubs Initiative, and get to lead a couple fellows that support our high school initiative as well. So I'm instrument rated private pilot and happy to be here today. Thank you. And Steven.
Hello, Steven.
You didn't ask him to say
I forgot
hello,
the transition.
That's
Next
okay.
time.
It's okay.
I need to put that in the notes.
Coordinator of Flight Training Initiative. So I get to work with a variety of folks here at You Can Fly. I get to touch a little bit of everything. My primary responsibility is our annual Flight Training Experience Survey, which launches September 1st. Take the survey this year, give us some feedback. I get to produce this lovely program and help out with a variety of other projects around the buildings. It's been a dream job for me. Having a great time.
Cool. All right. And then going to the next part here, Dan, you want to take it? Tell us a little about the foundation.
Yeah, just wanted to take a quick minute just to thank all of those that help support this program and the You Can Fly initiative as well. We are all part of the AOPA Foundation. Everything that we do is supported by donor money, so not a dollar of what the You Can Fly programs do or us is supported by AOPA membership dues. So we're really grateful for everyone that does make a donation. For those that have had a great aviation experience and want to pass that on, please consider donating to the AOPA Foundation. Greatly appreciated. And that can be done at aopafoundation.org. And speaking of generous donors, the Boeing family of companies, so Boeing, ForeFlight, Jeppesen, have stepped up and really helped support this webinar series and the You Can Fly program. We're real grateful for them. We would not be able to do that without this without them. So thank you, Boeing, ForeFlight, and Jeppesen. We appreciate you. And reminders, yes, yes. you can get wings credit for this webinar. Hopefully you have signed up for this webinar using your FAAsafety.gov email address, the same email address that you have registered with the FAA for. If you've done that, there's nothing more that you need to do. We'll take care of it. It normally takes a couple days after the webinar for all of that processing to go through. Stephen will jump on it right after, but it takes a little bit to get through the FAA and then post it to your account. So if you did not use your FAAsafety.gov email address or don't know, shoot us an email at ftinitiative@aopa.org. So FT is in Flight Training Initiative at aopa.org, and we'll be able to help sort that out for you. Also, this webinar is recorded. We're recording right now, so for those that would like to go back and review and check it out later, you can find it on YouTube. It'll take a couple days for that to post as well once we get up there, but look for it on the AOPA Pilot video channel under the Don't Get Rusty webinar playlist, and it also can be found at aopa.org webinars page, which is webinars.aopa.org.
Cool. And and Stephen, you want to tell us a little about our day in history, aviation history today?
Yes. Did you know the United States balloon Double Eagle II became the first balloon to cross the Atlantic back on August 17th, 1978. Started out in island in Maine. It took them about 6 days to get across the ocean and land in France.
I guess it's lucky they didn't land somewhere, hopefully, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Did they mean to do that, or did they just catch a favorable wind?
No, this was apparently the 14th known attempt to make that trip in a balloon of this kind. So,
brave pilots.
Took them 137 hours and 6 minutes.
Talk about worrying about having a lot of fuel on board for that thing. So crazy. All right, cool. All right, so what are we going to do today? Today we're going to talk about gliders and gliding, soaring, and sailplanes, and Scott's really going to take the lead on here and lead on this in just a moment. I'm just going to address some of the questions I'm seeing popping up there. Some folks are asking, and so we'll keep this in mind. Scott, they're asking about transitioning from being powered pilots, because a lot of our audience are certificated pilots, a lot of them powered. So we want to make sure maybe we address that towards the end or whatever. We want to make sure we talk about that transition, and I can talk about that too, since I did that myself. And then we're going to talk about some of the aspects, some of the things you can do with gliding, so the different launch methods, how they sustain flight, the facts and figures towards the end, and then we'll obviously stick around, and Scott's been kind enough to stick around and answer questions with us too. So that said, let's hit the poll really quick here to see what our folks are saying. What is the best reason someone should consider flying a glider or a sailplane? So if you would, please go on and answer the poll. We'll give you a moment to do that. And the choices, of course, are there are no fuel surcharges, so obviously way cheaper to do it. You can improve your pilot skills or piloting skills. You almost always have the right of way. It's just plain cool, or I make my own thrust. I don't need a glider. So what do you think? Kind of a silly poll today, but we're already seeing a trend in this. What do you think people are going to say there, Scott? Any predictions?
You just never know.
Fair enough. I guess you do never know. And so I know one of the things too, I was kind of wondering, and I was debating on putting in the poll or not, whether or not, like, how many folks out there have flown in gliders. I know I started in gliders, flew powered for a long time, and then went back and finished my glider add-on. So I'm kind of curious to know how many folks have touched that. If I've done plenty of Rusty Pilots presentations, and if that is any kind of gauge, usually it's only a few that you see the glider pilots in those presentations. All right, let's go ahead and close the poll. We see a very clear trend. And this, by the way, we have just hit something new. This is the first time that we've had one answer be a 0%. I think that has never happened before in all of DGR. So as you can see the results, you should be able to see them, or if not, we'll just go over them really quick. We've had the vast majority, 80% of people want to improve their pilot skills. And I think, Scott, you'll probably address how gliders can potentially do that. And then 17% just think they're cool. We always have the 1%. I always appreciate at least one person saying, I make my own thrust, the stupid one I put on the end. And then the no fuel surcharges was the other 1%er. And then 0%, nobody chose, you always have the right of way. You have the right of way. All right, so let's get to it, Scott. I'm going to go ahead and we'll go to this next screen. I'm going to turn the presentation over to you. So here it comes. And Scott, let me know if you've got that.
I do.
Awesome. All right, dazzle us with your gliding knowledge.
All righty. So gliding. I usually like to start out the presentation with some kind of a definition. And this is the one I found online: to descend gradually in controlled flight. The physics minor in me wasn't at all happy with that, so I came up with my own definition of gliding, which is having a horizontal component to a free fall. The idea being, of course, that this is a gravity-driven event, and through the miracle of aerodynamics, we're actually able to use the force of being pulled down through the air to create a horizontal component, and therefore a flight path that might look something like that. A couple important concepts in this world are how much horizontal we can get for the amount of vertical that we're giving up, glide ratio. But another important concept to most glider pilots is how fast are we sinking? What's the rate at which we're approaching the ground, because that determines how long we're going to be in the air. So what is a glider? It's one of the aircraft category. It fits right in there with airplane, rotorcraft, lighter than air. There's always one at the other end that I can never remember. I think it's power lift or something like that. I never understood.
At Al, perhaps too, right?
Yeah. The FAA has a definite definition of it. It's a heavier than air aircraft, but so is airplane rotorcraft. Supported in flight by the dynamic reaction of the air against its lifting surfaces. So we're still with airplane and rotorcraft. Here's the differentiator. The differentiator is whose free flight does not principally depend on an engine, which is not to say that gliders can't have engines, but typically our free flight doesn't involve one. So I'm not going to go back as far as the dinosaurs, but gliding has been around for a long time. This is a northern flying squirrel who's been capable of gliding for something like 36 million years, and actually has a glide ratio of 2 to 1. Just a little side story. There's a road that goes across the mountains in Tennessee called the Cherahawla Skyway, and somewhere along that line, there are on either side of the road are two really tall poles with no lines running between them. If you stop and read the sign, it tells you that those poles are a flying squirrel crossing. The squirrel goes up one pole and then glides across, so he doesn't have to cross the road.
I've never seen that before. That's crazy.
Yeah, it is. I've never seen it before either, or since. We primates have gotten into it a little more recently. This is a railroad engineer by the name of Octave Chanute, who was experimenting with building gliders and flying them down the sand dunes on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan. Chanute had learned a little bit about aerodynamics and what made a wing work, and a little bit about stability, but he didn't have much control over what he was doing, and ended up being a consultant to the Wright brothers.
Right.
In fact,
glad to see he's got his landing gear down.
What's that?
So I'm glad to see he's got his landing gear down on this one. So.
Oh yeah, he just got gear down. Yep.
Yeah.
The Wrights, in fact, used gliders to develop to make their greatest contribution to flight, which is to develop the control systems. Prior to that, people could kind of glide, but they really didn't have any control over the aircraft. So the Wrights used gliders to actually develop controlled flight. Gliding really got taken off after World War I, when Germany, based on the Treaty of Versailles, was told that they couldn't build airplanes. They turned their attention to building other flying machines, gliders, and built some amazing and beautiful machines. This particular aircraft, the Minimo, has a glide ratio of about 30 to 1, and it's just beautiful in general. And then, of course, during World War II, gliders were important military assets, carrying personnel and equipment into battle. Turns out my dad made his first trip to France in one of these. The X-15.
That first trip to France.
Yeah, it was his first time there. Yeah. The X-15, while not really thought of as a glider, its rocket motor only ran for 85 seconds, and at which point it's actually spent most of its time getting back to the ground as a glider. Didn't have a particularly good glide ratio, about 4 to 1, and it landed at 200 knots.
Wow.
But it was, in fact, a glider for most of its flight.
Huh.
The space shuttle, in fact, was certified as a glider. At hypersonic speeds, it had a 1 to 1 glide ratio. At supersonic speeds, it did about as good as the flying squirrel, about 2 to 1. And then once it went subsonic, it was about the same as the X-15. It was about 4 to 1.
Huh.
But it got the job done. Spaceship One, designed by Burt Rutan, was the first private aircraft to exceed Mach 2 and Mach 3 and to go above the Kármán line. And then after it burned out of fuel, by the way, its fuel was tire rubber and nitrous oxide. It's kind of crazy. But it,
Yeah, that is crazy.
after it got to altitude, it came back as a glider. And its successor, Virgin Spaceship Two, also a glider in operation today. Both of those aircraft, I know Spaceship Two had a glide ratio about 7 to 1, still does, and is now making commercial flights.
So it's almost like you're saying a lot of these aircraft have engines and things attached to them and so forth. But what you're getting at is it almost that every aircraft is potentially a glider?
Well, that's certainly true. I tell my airplane buddies that as soon as you're only one engine failure away from becoming a glider pilot.
Right.
So.
Hey, Scott, we had a question come through that I thought would be interesting just to help clarify. It was, could you just go over again what's the difference between the glide ratio versus sink rate? Could you just go over that real quick?
Sure. Glide ratio is how much horizontal you get for the amount of vertical that you get. So glide ratios are often expressed, for example, in gliders. The glide ratios are about anywhere between 30 to 1 and as we'll talk later, up to 70 to 1 in some gliders. Just as a comparison, your typical 172 has a glide ratio of about 9 to 1.
And that's the idea too. It's for every foot of altitude lost, you can move forward whatever that other number is. So like a 40 to 1, you move forward 40 feet for every foot lost in altitude, correct?
Yeah. So, or more realistically, so if you were a mile above the Earth, you could glide that many, you would land that many miles away.
Right.
Yeah. And then sink rate is just how fast you're coming down. So if you want to think about it in terms of what your vertical speed indicator says in your aircraft, if your vertical speed indicator says 500 feet a minute and you're 1,000 feet above the ground, you're going to be on the ground in 2 minutes.
Right.
So. Yep.
Hey, real quick, Scott, I wanted to mention, so people are asking about the handout. So we don't have normally we have a handout for everybody that's got links and everything, but this presentation ended up not really needing that. However, a little later in the presentation, Stephen will put out the slides. You can have the slide deck. We'll put a PDF out of that. So look for that a little later in the presentation, and it'll also be with the video when we put it up. Okay, sorry, back to you, Scott.
Okay. So if gliding is this, let's see, I'm still seeing, oh, maybe I need to click over.
There we
Okay.
go.
Yeah, I'm still seeing us in the middle of my screen at home, but that's all right. I've got the presentation on another screen. So anyway, if gliding is this continuous descent, then what is soaring? And by definition, soaring is to sustain gliding flight using rising air currents. A picture is often worth 1,000 words. So if you've ever watched, this is a red-tailed hawk. If you've ever watched these folks fly, in gliding world, we refer to these as the professionals. You can literally stay in the air all day just with using the rising air currents, and that's exactly what glider pilots are doing. We're just seeking out the rising air currents, and we'll talk about where those come from. By the way, a little known fact, soaring probably got started back with the Wright brothers. This is a little known fact. After the Wrights flew their powered aircraft, while they were at Kitty Hawk developing their control systems, Orville had the idea that under the right conditions, you could actually sustain gliding flight. And so he built an aircraft, came back to Kitty Hawk in 1911, and used this aircraft to set a record that stood for 11 or 12 years. He stayed right where you see him. He didn't move for 9 minutes and 45 seconds and just set a soaring record. By the way, that little thing that you see right on the front of the glider right out there is a protractor with a weather vane on it. It's an angle of attack indicator.
Okay.
The Wright brothers knew if you exceeded angle of attack, it was going to be a bad day. So
I think they learned it the hard way.
yeah, I think they did. And so he actually had an angle of attack indicator on this aircraft, and
That's really cool.
set a record. So by definition, then a sailplane is a glider which is designed for sustained flight. This is an example. This is my first glider. Well, it's not actually my first glider, but it's the glider. It's the model of the glider that I had, and it's absolutely beautiful. This is like the most beautiful thing I think maybe we've ever created. But in fact, it's often said that if flying were the language of humankind, soaring would be its poetry.
Mm-hmm.
This is a Glasser Derrick's DG303. It has a wingspan of 50 feet. And you can see how long and narrow the wings are. That tends to make the wing much more efficient. It'll stall at about 35 knots, but it'll go as fast as 135 knots. So these things are not slow machines. The empty weight is 540. The gross weight is 992. Now, lest you think you can be a 450-pound pilot and fly this aircraft is capable of carrying water ballast. And the reason it does that is that aerodynamically, the glide ratio that it's capable of, which is 44 to 1, and this is something that I'll talk about if there's another presentation I do to powered pilots about how you apply glider concepts to flying airplanes. But a little known fact is that the aerodynamics, the glide ratio of your airport is independent of your weight. And so you see this 44 to 1 ratio of 54 knots to 66. When the glider is fully loaded with the water ballast and it's flying at its gross weight, it achieves 44 to 1 at 66 knots. Without that water, it achieves the same glide ratio at 54 knots. So interesting dynamic
I'm
there.
assuming that's something you calculate before flight, and then you'll know what your speed to fly is that day, or that would speed to fly, or I know you'll talk, maybe we'll do that in a future presentation, but.
Scott had a question come in about weight limit, so I'm glad that you had talked about that. That was an interesting concept, that the glide ratio doesn't change, it's the speed. But just had someone chime in and say, I get negative comments about gliding because I'm close to the upper weight limit, in about 225 pounds in this situation. Any thoughts as to why that would be? I know that's speculating to speaking for someone else, but maybe issues, concerns being close to the upper weight limit, 225 pounds?
Yeah, it's typically a certification of the aircraft limitation. So, for example, European aircraft are certified with a maximum seat load of, I believe, 240 pounds. And so it's not about how much you weigh. There are some gliders that can carry people that are heavier than that. It's a function of what the certification limits are on the glider. Most of the gliders now are European designs, and they have a certification limit of the seat weight, which is why you're taking a little bit of grief on how much you weigh. They can't legally carry you if you weigh more than that in the aircraft. Okay, I just wanted to get to 44 to 1 because this line represents a horizontal line, an infinite glide ratio. The yellow line is 44 to 1, which I find absolutely amazing that any aircraft can achieve that kind of a glide ratio. But it gets better. This is an ASG 29, has an 18-meter wingspan, so almost 60 feet between the wings. This thing gets 50 to 1.
Jeez.
And we're not done. This is a Nimbus 4. You can see the wings keep getting longer. This is 85 feet between the wingtips, glide ratio of 60 to 1. And this is the granddaddy. This is the Ada, 101 feet between the wingtips, 70 to 1 glide ratio. The joke is that if you're in an Ada, if you can see it, you can glide to it. By the way, there's another glider. There's another glider called the 126. It was built by Schweitzer back in the 70s. A single-seat glider, a lot of fun to fly. The joke about the glide ratio in the 126 is that if you can see it over the nose, you can't get to it. So
it's kind of like a powered airplane in that sense.
Yeah, a little bit like that. Yeah. So how do we get these things into the air? The most common method, at least in the US, is an aero tow, which is pretty much like it sounds. We tie a rope between the two aircraft and we literally pull them into the air with an airplane. And then once up at altitude, the glider decides where it's going to get off and then goes on about flying as a glider. There is also the next launch method is called ground launch. Back in the day, auto tow was common, and it's literally what it sounds like. They hooked a rope between some old car with a big engine in it, and they literally pulled the glider into the air like a kite. Inexpensive and needs a lot of runway, but can be done. The modern way of ground launching is using something called a winch. This bad boy is a custom designed glider winch. It has a 450 horsepower diesel engine in it, high torque, driving a pair of take-up reels that have about 4,000 to 6,000 feet of high strength plastic rope on them. You put this thing on one end of the runway, you pull the rope to the other end and hook it to the glider. And this is the result. Let's see, you're trying to make it go, Chris.
Yeah, try clicking on it. Hopefully it goes.
Here we go. I got back to the screen I need to be. Okay, here we go. Oops, did I lose it?
Try going back. Yep. See, you can try looking for the little arrow on it. There we go.
There we go. A dead stop to flying speed in 3 seconds. The glider is now climbing at somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 feet a minute.
So it's like a jet taking off, right? It's like a fighter jet.
It's faster. It may be faster than a jet. I don't know. Well, I guess gliders go up at, or jets will go up at 4,000 or 5,000 feet a minute. Airliners don't, but
Right.
yeah, you're literally from a dead stop on the ground to 2,000 or 3,000 feet above the ground in 30 seconds.
That's crazy.
It's the closest any of us are ever going to get to a catapult launch off an aircraft carrier.
Scott, I grew up flying 2-meter sailplane gliders that use a high start, which is surgical tubing, and then a long line stretched way back. I can't believe how similar that launch with a human being in it was to a 2-meter radio control glider, because that thing just takes off and it goes straight up and it goes up fast. It's like a rocket. So I can't imagine actually being in the glider and feeling that with a winch launch. That is amazing.
It's a 1G acceleration, and you're just not ready for it. In fact, when you're training, the first time you go to the training organization, the pilot behind you says, you're just along for the ride. I don't care how much experience you have in a glider, you're not ready for about what's about to happen to you. And you realize shortly after that why they don't want you anywhere near the controls of the glider, because the thing just takes off, and then you're pitched up at 45 degrees, which you're not used to seeing, and it's just a hoot. This is how the Europeans get most of their aircraft into the air.
That's great. And just real quick, I'm just kind of curious, because I know there's a place out here in West Virginia that does this, and I need to go out there and do it. But are you controlling pitch with this, or is the rope just kind of pulling you along? I mean, what kind of control inputs are you giving?
So it's actually pretty simple. You control the airspeed of the glider on the climb with the pitch attitude, pretty much like you would. And so there's a maximum speed that you want to be going.
Okay.
It depends on the winch. Sometimes the winch driver is controlling the tension on the line, which controls the speed of the glider, and sometimes you're working with them to control the speed of the glider. So it's just a matter of maintaining pretty much a steady speed on the way up. The glider follows a parabolic arc. So once you get up over the top of the winch driver cuts the power on it, and the release is designed to automatically release, but you also pull the release. But it literally rides over in 30 seconds.
You just covered 2 questions that came through on winch launch. I think everyone watching is as interested as we are. The first question was how fast. Do you have an idea of how fast that the winch is being operated?
Well, your airspeed is not at all abnormal. The winch speeds are somewhere around maybe 50 or 60 knots on the way up. It's just that you're in a 45-degree bank or 45-degree pitch attitude, and
sure,
you would think that you would stall in that, except that stall is not about airspeed, it's about angle of attack, and it's just a comparison of the wing to the flight path, so that you're nowhere near stalling, even though you're pitched up at 45 degrees.
That's fascinating. And then you also covered the one that said the winch line is automatically detached. That was one that came through. There were some questions wondering, well, how do you get off of that line once you get up to altitude?
Well, the release mechanisms are designed so when the winch operator chops the power, the drag on the line will create a big bow in the winch line, and you'll get a back force on the line, and the release mechanisms are all designed to come apart if you pull backwards on them. Mm-hmm. So it will come off by itself, but just to be on the safe side, when we feel the power come off the winch, we'll pull the release to make sure that we're actually coming off.
That's cool.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And I know safety feature wise too, I remember Michael Hangartner here went out and did some of this, and he said too that even as an extra safety feature, if for some reason the winch or that line would get stuck to your glider, it wouldn't come off, they cut it, or they have a way to release it from the winch, don't they?
Yeah, they have a guillotine on the winch.
Yeah.
Yeah, then you're flying around with 3,000 feet of rope on the bottom of your glider,
Right.
but
Obviously, that's a major problem.
that's better than not getting off the rope. Yeah.
Yes.
Cool.
Right.
Are you required to have like a forward stick pressure on that? Is that kind of finding that sweet spot as you're getting pulled up?
No, it's just it's pretty much normal pitch controls. You're just pitching for an airspeed. You're just trying to maintain an airspeed. So you just pretty much pitch naturally as you need to. There's no particular strong or push or pull on it. You're just doing whatever you normally do to maintain an airspeed.
All right. Well, let's Scott keep going here. We got more questions about this. We'll have to make sure we come back to this because people are curious. Where can I do this? You know, and other questions about it. So we'll have to come back to that at the end.
Yeah, it is a hoot. It's worth the money. The final launch method is self-launch. It turns out that somewhere between 1/2 and 2/3 of all of the gliders being manufactured these days have an engine in them. And having an engine doesn't determine whether you're an airplane or whether you're a glider. It's a certification thing. But so this is this aircraft has an engine down inside the fuselage that drives a pop-up pylon. This is the aircraft that I currently have. It's electrically driven, has an electric motor up in the nose, and it takes off. And once you're up there, you shut the motor down, and the blades just fold against the fuselage, and you're back to being.
Is this one too? Because obviously they have just the one main gear. Do you have to have a wing runner when you're doing the self-launch like this, or?
No, you have a wingtip wheel. So I'll just take off with one wing on the ground, and once I get going, I've got enough aileron authority to lift the wing.
Okay.
Interesting enough, just the motor torque will also help me lift one of the wings.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then, of course, whether your eyes believe it or not, that's a jet engine on there. So there are jet engine powered gliders where that engine will retract after you're up. So those are 3 launch methods. By the way, launch methods are like, they're just endorsement based. So when you first get your pilot certificate, you may learn on an arrow tow. In order to winch launch or to self-launch, you just need to go some additional training and get an endorsement for that type of launch method. So now that we're up there, how do we stay there? Again, soaring is the sustained flight based on rising air currents, which we call lift. And so where do we find this stuff? The answer is small scale convective cycles, orographic effects, atmospheric standing waves, and air mass collisions. Or as we in glider world call it, thermals, ridge, wave, and convergence. So I got to get to my movie again. For some reason or other,
you may want to try clicking on the picture itself. Maybe that'll start it.
Well, I can't get to the picture because the picture of you and me is stuck over the top of my slide right now.
Oh. Okay.
And I'm trying to get to my slide, and when I try to go to my slide, I can't make it go.
Okay. Do you want me to take over and you can tell me where to go with these, or?
If you can, yeah.
Sure.
Or is there? I'm trying to figure out if there's some way I can get rid of this window that's over the. Oh, here we go. I think I'm over.
Got it.
Okay.
All right. Cool.
All right. Here we go. All right, so typically on any given day when you've got a relatively clear sky and it was a cool night before and the sun starts shining on the ground gets hot and the air above that ground gets hot and hot air becomes buoyant and it begins to rise. And as it rises, it cools and you'll get a cloud typically forming at the top of it. And so basically there's a column of rising air under every one of those cumulus clouds. And if you could see them, it might kind of look like this. So what we'll do in a glider is we'll be flying around looking for a cloud to fly under because we know that under that cloud is a rising column of air because that's why the cloud is there. And so we'll approach that the cloud, and in the aircraft is an instrument called a variometer, which is like a sensitive vertical speed indicator. And you'll see as we approach this rising column of air that we'll get an indication on the variometer that we're in fact now climbing. And so what we'll do as a glider pilot is we'll do what the hawks and the soaring birds will do is we'll start circling in that rising air. Starts to look a little bit like this. And you'll see that as we come around to where we started, we're higher than we were before.
Mm-hmm. That's
And you
cool.
can actually, depending on where you are, I've been in thermals. I hit a thermal one of the last times I was flying in Florida. I was going up at 1,300 feet a minute in a rising air current.
Wow.
Yeah. Typically in the Midwest, you're going to get things like more like 2 or 3 or 400 feet a minute. But even that's pretty exciting to be able to actually climb an aircraft with no engine. It's probably one of the most exciting things that people do in a glider is just the amazing fact that with no engine at all, you can circle in this rising air just like the hawks and the buzzards and the eagles do, and you're able to climb an aircraft. It's pretty amazing.
And
Scott,
let me tell you. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Dan. Go ahead.
no, I had a quick question. You'd mentioned variometer, variometer. Not sure what's the acceptable way to say that. I'm going to say both.
Yep.
But what's the difference between that and a vertical speed indicator, VSI?
It's a little more sensitive. It has an extra device in it called a capacity flask. Both a VSI and a vertical speed indicator are measuring the rate of pressure change around the aircraft. And so it's just that the variometer is more sensitive than a vertical speed indicator is. It gives you an indication a little quicker and a little more accurately than a VSI does. Functionally, they're the same thing. They're telling you whether you're climbing or descending.
And the one thing I was just going to say to everybody too is if you have not flown in a glider, this is how they hook you. Because I remember one of my first glider flights, it was after I'd become a powered pilot. I went back again and they took me out and started thermaling, and that was like the coolest thing ever. And I was like, yep, I want to do this. So.
Yep, it is pretty amazing. Another form of lift is called ridge lift or orographic lift. And it's basically, if you can imagine this ridge that we have off to our right side here, if you have a decent wind blowing up from left to right up the side of that ridge, the air is deflected up by the terrain and creates an area of rising air. And so what we'll do with the glider is we'll fly into that at about a 45-degree angle so that we have the option to turn away if we need to. But you'll see as we approach this ridge here on the variometer right here, you see that we're into rising air right now. And you can literally fly down the ridge, either holding altitude and quite often just climbing. This lifting effect will often go 2 and 3 times the height of the ridge. So you can actually be flying above the ridge. You can see by the proximity of the hill that this would not be a time to be texting. So you need to pay attention to what you're doing. It can be a reasonably rough ride based on turbulence coming off the hill. So you want to strap yourself in. But you can literally fly, as long as the ridge is on the right day with the wind coming from the right direction. Chris probably knows you've talked to people who've flown the ridges on the eastern part of the United States from Pennsylvania all the way down into Tennessee yes. on the right day.
That blew my mind. Like when I first started learning to fly out in Harford County, and that's exactly what they told me. All the way down to Tennessee from like right here in Maryland and everything. By the way, the variometer. I'm just trying to look. Can you explain where on the dash it is? It looks like it's that top left one.
Just top left, just to the left, just to the left of the airspeed indicator.
Yeah.
And here we are at ridge height. Turn it around and go back the other way and work some more of it. We'll make the turns away from the ridge, as you can imagine, into the wind, because if you turn the other way, you might end up over the other side of the ridge where, as wonderful it is on this side, it's miserable on the other side. Turbulent and the air going down as fast as it is coming up on this side. So. And again, the flights here can be long distance, just cruising along. A great way to fly.
Yeah. And just so you know, I know we had a question earlier on, and I think Dan's going to bring it back up later. So when we talk about cross country, and so this obviously is one way that you could go cross country, but we'll talk more about that when we get to that point.
Yep. You can go cross country with thermals or with ridge. Another interesting effect is called mountain wave, or just wave flight. This is where a stable air mass is forced over some kind of an obstruction like a ridge or a mountain. You get the same kind of effect as you've probably seen water going over a rock in a stream, where downstream of the rock, you'll see what are called standing waves, which are generated by the stability of the water trying to regain its original position. The same thing happens with air. And so if you've got a strong enough wind blowing over an obstruction, you can get this wave effect. Underneath the waves, you're going to find some very turbulent air, but in the wave itself, the air is almost perfectly smooth, and the rate of climb can be just incredible. And the altitudes that you can reach are amazing. We'll talk about a little earlier. Out in the western part of the United States, climbs to 20 and 30,000 feet are not at all uncommon in wave flight. And the altitude record for a glider was actually set in a wave condition called the polar vortex, which I'll talk to you about in a bit. So another form of lift. And then finally, there is the, I'm sorry?
Now, a quick question. With these rising forces, the wave lift, the thermals, are some more turbulent than others? Is it a smooth ride? What's the experience as the glider pilot there? Like, how is that lift? How does the lift feel?
So thermals can be a little bit turbulent, but not too bad because you're flying at relatively low speeds. Ridge lift can be reasonably turbulent because of the proximity to the terrain. You get a lot of variation in the airflow, and so you can get a certain amount of turbulence. In fact, it can be pretty bad. The higher you get above the ridge, the more that would settle down. And the wave is absolutely smooth. I mean, the way that you know that you're into the wave is everything is just all of a sudden it's just silky smooth. Yep. The last form of lift is called convergence. This is where two air masses run into each other and have nowhere to go but up. You'll often find this along seashores. Central Florida is famous for this, where the air currents come in from the ocean during the day when the ground heats up, and they collide with each other, and you get this row of cumulus clouds down the middle of the state that you can just ride down for miles. I've seen the same effect along the western shore of Lake Michigan, where the cold air comes off the lake and bumps into the warm air on land, and you get a convergence lift. You can also find convergence sometimes in a mountain valley, where at the end of the day, as the air cools and comes down both sides of the valley, it meets in the middle and collides, and it will provide a convergence that you can ride late in the day.
So obviously, as a glider pilot, you end up learning a lot more about, even more detail about weather than we would as powered pilots, because you're getting into some specific effects that you want to use.
Yeah, it's a much more localized kind of weather, but it'll depend on what the larger weather systems are. So, for example, if you're looking for ridge lift, you're looking for a wind condition that's going to blow with relative strength from a particular direction onto the ridge, and that's going to make the ridge work. Same with the wave.
Cool.
So, landing. How do you land without an engine? And the answer is you just arrive with enough kinetic energy that you can manage. The difference is, of course, that in a pure glider, you only get one shot at it. And so you're going to land somewhere, and ideally back at the airport. So the idea is to arrive back at the airport with enough altitude to complete the maneuver. We'll typically fly the same kind of traffic pattern that airplanes do, just to be good neighbors so that airplanes don't have to wonder what we're doing. So we'll fly a 45-degree entry approach and a downwind and a base. However, gliders, because they have only one shot at it, are given right away over powered aircraft. And so it may be that we have to alter this pattern in some way to make sure that we end up where we want to end up. The way we get the glider down is we have these devices out on the wing called, sometimes called spoilers, sometimes called air brakes, dive brakes. But what they do is they modulate the lift to drag ratio of the glider and therefore the glide ratio. And we can, this particular glider has, with the air brakes closed, about 40-to-1, with them fully open, about 5-to-1. So we have a great deal of control over our descent rate, and we can land these things very accurately in very very tight spaces. So we'll end up flying a base leg and a final, and then it's pretty much a normal landing. We're just in the same way that you'd be using a throttle at this point to control your descent rate. We're just modulating the air brakes. And then the landing is pretty much normal. Other than that, we've only got that single landing gear. So once we touch the ground roll is a little bit different in that you have to continue to fly the aircraft all the way to a stop.
And I remember I told you when I did my hat on, I remember Jan teaching me that too, and getting to go half brake on downwind, as I recall, and then we could use it literally like a throttle or half spoiler.
In fact, I used to use that explanation for airplane pilots until one day I was working with an airplane pilot, and I said the air brake works just like a throttle. Move it exactly the same way you would with a throttle, which is fine until we came into the flare, and all of a sudden the glider hit the ground like a ton of bricks. What the heck? Well, what does an airplane pilot do when you come into the flare? You go to idle. You pull the handle all the way back in the glider, and the air brakes come fully open. You lose all of that lift, and you just slam onto the ground like a. I said I will never use that example with another airplane pilot. A lesson learned. We have a concept in glider world called landing out. You know, without an engine, it is possible that you're not going to get back to the airport. And gliders are designed for, and pilots are trained to land in, you know, anything that's landable. The good news is that gliders are readily and easily taken apart. And so if you do end up in a field like this, you just give a call to your friends and they bring your glider trailer out. Two people can have a glider apart and into the trailer and heading back home again in about 20 minutes. So it's all part of the sport. So why would you want to do this? One of the answers is flying gliders is just fun. I mean, it's just a fun way to fly. You don't necessarily do this to travel. It's a recreational kind of activity. And it tends to be much more social than airplane flying, in that you pretty much need a village to run a glider operation. You know, you need your tow pilot. You're going to help each other put your gliders together and take them apart. You can't taxi them, so you're being pulled around the airport, pulling each other around with golf carts. And once you land, you know, getting you off the runway again is kind of a group activity. So it's a very social kind of thing, which makes it kind of different. It can also be relatively challenging. There's a part of the sport called cross-country flying, where basically you're trying to go somewhere and hopefully get back again using various sources of lift. So, for example, the thermal lift, where you climb under a thermal to get some altitude, you use that altitude to glide to the next source of thermal lift, you climb back up again, and you just repeat that process for hours on end. And you can literally fly, you know, hundreds of miles and come back home again. And all just using the energy in the atmosphere. It really is amazing. You could also use ridge or wave to do the same thing, or convergence. Any of the sources of lift, anything that'll get you a little more altitude that you can exchange for distance.
And hey, Scott, real quick, the one question I saw earlier on that I'll throw out here too for that cross-country part is somebody was asking, could you fly a glider and land at another airport, or do you always land back at the one that you departed from?
Oh yeah, you're free to, and in fact, I recommend it if you're going to fly across country. I'd recommend that you plan on landing at another airport. What's really fun is if you have somebody following you with your trailer, and you land at another airport, and they're there meeting you, and you just take the glider apart, put it together, and take it home again.
And I guess if you knew there was another glider port around, you could also just get a tow to take off again, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Assuming there's still lift to take you back. It could be that the reason you landed at that glider port is because you'd run out of lift. The lift is gone, and you're there. But yeah, if it's another glider port, they can tow you back into the air, and you can head back in the other direction.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. Another reason that you might fly gliders is that there are recognized levels of achievement. These ABC bronze are internationally recognized achievement goals based on, you know, soloing the glider, your first soaring flight, getting ready for cross-country flights, and then setting, you know, attaining certain kind of altitude gains after release and flying certain distances. These are all recognized achievement goals. There's also any number of records available for you to set at the state, national, and world record. The types of records might be distance flown, altitude gained, the speed over a particular course. The records can be set in various categories and can also be set in any one of these glider classes. In fact, I did the math here for 50 states, 153 nations in the world, and then 4 types of records in 3 different kind of categories in 7 or 8 different kinds of gliders. If you were a young female, you have the potential to hold more than 21,000 individual records in a glider. So, so there's a goal for you. And then, of course, anything that man has ever created, we have then raced, and so competition becomes a part of the sport. There is what I call personal or unofficial competition. For example, you get 2 gliders in a thermal, and you can bet there's now a race to the top. Or we used to, you know, whoever flew the longest flight of the day had bragging rights, that kind of thing. Clubs will often offer kind of unofficial kinds of things like spot landing contests, or, you know, bombing runs, or other kinds of things. And then, of course, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Scott, speaking of long flights, what's the longest flight that you've been on?
In terms of distance, I'm not quite sure, but I was in the air for 6.5 hours. And the only reason I landed is I had to pee really bad. I suspect I wasn't in a particular hurry to go anywhere, but I probably flew 150 miles that day.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
But that's not, that's not anything out of the ordinary for people that do this kind of thing. There is then contest flying. There are 7 U.S. regional contests in the U.S. There are the national contests. In fact, the 18-meter class nationals are going on in Uvalde, Texas right now. And the World Glider Championships are coming to the U.S. Sometime soon. Typically, these contests are based on cross-country types of flights. Quite often, they're timed events where everybody flies the same course, and whoever flies it over the best average speed is the winner of that day. But they're also regatta-type races where there's a simultaneous start of all the gliders, and then the first one across the finish wins the race. And there's aerobatic competition at the national and world level. So, glider certification. You can solo a glider at 14, private at 16, commercial CFI at 18. There is no medical certificate required to fly a glider, which is not to say that you still don't have to conform to 9153, which is if there's any reason you shouldn't be flying it, you shouldn't be flying it. But you don't need a medical certificate to fly a glider. The initial flight experience for an initial rating, 10 hours of total time, 20 flights in a glider, 2 hours of solo flight. Back to the question of if you already have a pilot certificate and you'd like to add a glider category rating, by regulation, you could do that in as little as 3 hours, 10 solo flights. And then there is a practical test, oral and flight test for either one of those category add-on radons. So there's your certification requirements. A couple interesting facts and figures, number of glider pilots and clubs and commercial operations in the US. The altitude record in a glider is a little over 76,000 feet set by the Perlin project back in 2018, flying something called a wave effect called the polar vortex over the Andes Mountains. The Perlin project is currently back in Argentina right now. Their objective is 90,000 feet in a glider. The distance record in a glider was just set back in June by a couple of guys in California flying wave in California. They were up for 17 and a half hours.
Wow.
And flew almost 1,900 miles.
Two-place glider, I assume, with that, because there's 2 of them there. Or?
Yep, 2-place glider.
Okay.
Yep. And the speed record in a glider is 190 mile an hour average, held by Klaus Ullmann over a 310-mile course. For more information on the sport of soaring, you can go to the Soaring Society of America's website at ssa.org. And in terms of where you might get a glider ride and other kinds of things, there's an app there on the website called Where to Fly. And you click on that, it shows you a map of the United States. You click on one of the states, it will show you little glider icons, and you click on a glider icon, and it will give you information about that soaring site, whether it's a club or commercial operation, when they fly, what they fly, whether they give rides or not, and contact information so that you can arrange to go experience this amazing way of flying. Okay, I'm done.
Okay, let me go ahead and I'll take the screen back and I'll put that same bit up. So we hopefully should see my screen now, guys. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, and I had the same thing with the SSA. So let's tell you what, let's do, we'll do the questions here in just a moment. Let's go ahead and do that sort of end of webinar stuff, and then we will go back and hit all the questions that folks might have. So if you are sticking around hoping to get wings credit, this is the time. So officially, you've got your wings credit. I know Scott has been kind enough to wait around, and I tell you, I found myself going like, I've got to get back in gliders. I've got to do it again. So we'll talk more about this in just a moment. But here is the pilot passport code. By the way, this is not wings credit. For wings credit, as long as you have registered, or maybe if you didn't register, maybe if you send it in to Stephen at ftinitiative@aopa.org, just you give us the email that you use for FAAsafety.gov, just that email. So if you register with it, we've already got it. You don't have to do anything. If for some reason you did not register using that same email, then email us at ftinitiative, that's Foxtrot Tango Initiative at AOPA.org, and we'll make sure you get that. Now, Stephen, tell us a little bit more about this pilot passport, and there's this code here. Again, just to clarify before he starts, this part is not wings credit.
Okay, correct. Yeah, the pilot passport function is a piece of the AOPA app. It's a function built in that lets you look at different airports around the country, pulls up information and things you can check out to do some traveling and visiting, and it lets you check in as you go to these different locations. There's a badges and point system that goes with that, so it kind of gamifies doing a little exploration around the country and earning kind of like stamps at different airports at different places. Our marketing folks do occasionally do some contests, so keep an eye out for that if you're using the app. And some of the points and things will help you win some prizes every once in a while. So we have our code here that makes for a special unique badge for our presentations each month. They're very kind to give us. And again, this has nothing to do with Wings credit. It's just for the AOPA app.
Correct. All right. Thanks, Stephen. And by the way, you maybe jot the code down. It's just YCF web, as in like you can fly webinar, and then the date, August 17th, 23, so 081723. If everybody, maybe we recommend do not all try to log in right now, because what we've had happen is we've got such a great audience here that you kind of overload the server and then it doesn't work. So give it a little time, maybe try that in 20 minutes, half an hour or so, and you should be able to get that credit. If everybody does it at once, it probably won't work because the server will be overwhelmed. They are not capable of handling the power of our Don't Get Rusty audience. I'll just say that. Okay. Real quick for next time, just so you know, September 21st, 2023, and I'll mention this again later, 12 to 1 Eastern or 1600 UTC, we're going to be avoiding capital punishment, navigating the DC CIFRA. That's the name of that episode. So we're going to have Drew Myers back on with us again, and Drew and I are going to talk about how you can handle the DC CIFRA and give you a heads up on what that's all about and what you can do. So I hope you'll join us for that one. There's the website or the email there, ftinitiative@aopa.org. And also let us know whether it's in the chat or shoot us an email. Tell us if there's other topics. I know we've got lots of questions about gliders here, so we're gonna answer those now. But if you've got other ideas for things that you'd like us to talk about or guests you'd like us to have on, let us know. This is how this glider one happened. People kept asking us, and I would mention that I flew gliders. And so I was like, you know what? I'm not qualified to talk with authority about it, but I know somebody who is, and that's how we got Scott on board. So let's get back to it. Dan, what are the questions we've got for Scott?
Well, I'm a bit embarrassed because as we were planning through this yesterday, I was thinking there's not going to be that many questions. No problem. We'll get through this. I've got pages of questions copied to get through, so I'm glad we're done a little bit early. So really, a lot of them were rooted around transition from certificated airplane single engine land type rating to gliders. So without getting into the specifics of all of them, could you just walk us through that process at a high level, Scott?
Sure. So a glider rating is simply a category rating. So if you learn to fly in airplanes, or if you learn to fly in a helicopter, you already have a private pilot certificate, and all you're doing is you're adding the aircraft category rating to that. It requires that you take the training as defined in the regulations for learning to fly this type of aircraft, and then you will take a practical test at the end of it. If you already have a pilot certificate, there's no a private pilot certificate in airplane, and I think helicopter. There's no need to take the written exam for glider, but there is the practical exam at the end that'll examine your knowledge. So it's just a matter of taking going to an airport that does this type of training and going through the training process.
Speaking of the examination, what does a check ride cost for that?
Sorry, what was the question?
Oh, what does a check ride cost? There was questions about the exam process.
I think it depends on where it's done. Sometimes at a club there may be an examiner that does it for nothing, but I don't know for sure. I would guess that I would have to guess because I've never paid for one. I think I've heard $200 to $500 for the examiner fee for a category rating.
And I was just going to say too, when doing this as well, because I actually did this. I was a powered pilot in CFI, and I started in gliders, but just didn't finish the rating. And then it was a few years ago. I'm looking at the picture up here above my computer. But I went down, and you can go to a place like you can go to a club and do this. The club, it takes a little longer, and Scott might say that because you're waiting your turn in line and that sort of thing. But I went and went and did it at a school and it was a Seminole Lake glider park is where I went. So I went down and I spent, I think it was about 4 or 5 days. And in fact, I soloed on the first day that I was there because it's like we flew enough. I think we did 12 flights, and then the instructor Jan, he had said to me, he's like, "Hey, how are you feeling?" And I'm like, "I'm getting kind of tired." He's like, "You got one more?" And then he just gets out of the glider and sends me up solo. So so you could do it. And in fact, I would recommend that as a power pilot, going and get it done, kind of concentrated. And then I was able to go after that. And I went up and visited a club after that after I got it. So it's a way to kind of efficiently get it done. And I think I spent, it was just over $2,000 maybe it was around there. It wasn't terribly expensive. I'd saved up the money on purpose for it, but considering how many times I flew. So anyway, that was including all the fee for the DPE.
Cool. So you had mentioned that, Chris, that you had 2 people in the glider. There's a question that came through there is like dual training gliders. Is that safe to fly? Is that work?
I'll let Scott take this stuff. He's the CFIG here.
Is it safe to fly a 2-passenger glider?
That question came through, just like, what about training with 2 people? Is that a safe thing to do?
Well, it's no different than training with 2 people in an airplane. I mean, you have an instructor who's there to make sure you don't that you come back to the ground safely, and it's no different than training in a 2-place airplane. It's
I was going to say, it reminded me a little bit of like I think I was in a Blahnik, and I forget which model it was, but it was a 2-seat Blahnik, and it reminded me a little bit of like being in the cockpit of like a Cub, where you're in tandem.
Yeah, it's
and,
a tandem seat.
Yeah, and so I remember like it's I think that airplane pilots, other than the fact that there's not a lot of stuff in there's a lot more bare bones in that sort of thing. It didn't seem any different to me than flying with an instructor in a Cub or an airplane like that.
Yep, pretty much the
Except
same.
for the view's way better.
The view is way better.
Yes, way better.
And it's quieter. You don't need headsets to talk to each other.
Sure. So
Yeah,
we know that, like all other aircraft, there's weight allowances there. Is there a typical weight allowance for glider pilots that you could be rule of thumb that would get them flying in most gliders?
Well, again, most of the gliders these days are European design, and they have certification limits of no, I believe it's no more than 240 pounds in any one seat. So there's kind of your limit. Now there are gliders. There's a glider that Schweitzer built called an SGS 232, which is actually has a big back seat in it. It was designed to carry 2 people in the back seat. And I had a friend of mine one time who wanted to go fly, and he was over the normal weight limit, but he was able to fly in the back seat of the 232 at considerably more than 240 pounds.
Okay.
So it is possible, but that's about the limit for most. And again, it's a certification limit.
Sure. One of the listeners, viewers, is planning to get a commercial ticket in both airplanes and gliders. Do you have a recommendation as to which order they should do that?
I started out in airplanes and went to gliders later, and I tell everybody that if I had the choice, I would have started in gliders. Because you just get a much better sense of what it is to fly, and a much better sense of the energy system, of the exchange of kinetic and potential energy, and energy management becomes much more tuned. One of the things that getting a glider rating will do is it'll make you a better airplane pilot. Just in terms of, in fact, just a couple examples. The guy who put the Airbus into the Hudson, Sullenberger, was a glider pilot. Sully was a glider pilot. He knew when his engines quit. He could tell exactly whether he knew he wasn't going to make it to Teterboro. He knew he wasn't going to make it back to LaGuardia. He could tell by the performance of the aircraft that the only place he could land that safely was in the river. There's another famous glider called the Gimli glider. It was a 767, Canada Air 767, that ran out of fuel over Manitoba at like 41,000 feet. And the pilot of that aircraft was a glider pilot who immediately started using glider concepts to recognize that there's no way he could then divert to Winnipeg anymore. His co-pilot was an ex Air Force guy that knew that there was an abandoned Air Force base nearby, and they literally dead sticked that 767 into an Air Force base that had been turned into a drag strip. and safely landed it. Nobody on the aircraft or nobody on the aircraft, nobody on the ground was hurt. But that the fact that he was a glider pilot, he was able to apply things he knew about gliders to get that 767 onto the ground with no power. So you'll become a lot more comfortable with an engine out once you've flown a glider because you never have an engine. You're the way that you perceive things and the way you sense what's happening with the aircraft and how everything's going. You'd barely give a second thought to have a dead engine in an airplane because you know exactly how to deal with it. And so you also just pay a lot more attention to weather. You pay a lot more attention to flight planning. You become much more situationally aware flying a glider, and that all spills over into your airplane flying. Highly recommend starting in gliders and then going to power later.
Great, thank you. What is the equivalent of the impossible turn?
We were just talking about this one.
It really depends, but it's pretty much routine to do what's referred to as a simulated rope break or simulated power failure in glider training. Where
200 feet, 200 feet, we do it.
Yeah, and that's just because it's relatively safe to do it. You can let a student do it at 200 feet. If you were highly proficient, you could do it at less than that. But yeah, it's pretty amazing. But again, it's all a function of knowing what your aircraft is capable of. So the impossible turn will vary with the aircraft. You can do it in a glider at considerably lower altitudes than you can because of the performance capabilities of the glider. In an airplane, it can be done. You just have to know when it can be done. Fundamentally, it's not any different. You just need to understand what your performance limitations are.
We had a lot of requests for specific places to fly gliders. What was that SSA website again, where they could find opportunities to fly?
SSA.org, and there's a link there called Where to Fly.
Perfect. Thank you.
It will show you a map of the United States, and then you click on that map, and it'll zoom in on a particular area, like Virginia, and it'll show you a number of little glider icons, and you click on the glider icons, and it tells you the name of the organization, whether they're a club or commercial operation, contact information, hours of operation, websites that you could connect to. It's a great resource if you're looking for a place to fly.
And probably one thing to be aware of there too, when you're going to look at that, is that maybe Scott will go a little more into detail about this, but the difference between a commercial school or commercial operation and the club, because like in my general impression and what I was dealing with was the commercial thing was nice when I wanted to go get the certificate done quickly, because I could go down there. I reserved time like a month or two ahead of time. I called them. They even had a place for me to, like, they had a little place I could stay. I was paying like 20 or 30 bucks a night. It was super cheap, right? And did that. And then I had an instructor who was my instructor for those however many days. And I just had all that time to get it done very quickly. But obviously that costs a little bit more, right? And it's probably not the way you would want to fly regularly. But then the club, that's where I know, and just having done that a little bit, you have that social aspect that Scott talked about. You can definitely train in a club. It's like you're just taking turns there, so it can take a little bit longer. But maybe Scott can talk a little bit more about recommendations on how to pursue training or transitions with that stuff.
Yeah, and I would echo what Chris just said. Again, the club environment is a little more laid back. It's all volunteer, so they typically don't operate on a 7-day-a-week basis like commercial operations would. And it will vary with the club. Some clubs have very extensive training programs, very well organized, and some are just limited by either equipment and or available instructors, or the weather's always a limitation. So it'll take you longer at a club. It'll cost you probably less money, but it'll take you more time overall in terms of like calendar months. So when I was learning to fly, I actually checked out a club and a commercial operation, went to both of them and talked to the people there about, what am I getting myself into? And I chose to go, I went with the commercial operation, but lots of folks learn to fly at clubs.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
It's not like you're in a race. So even if it takes you, all summer or this summer and next summer, so what? This is not a race. This is just a goal in mind. So, yep.
Yep.
Cool.
Just whatever works for you.
Would you ever have to bail out of a glider if something bad happens?
Oh yeah, it's been done. And in fact, the racing gliders like the DGs that I showed you, and all of the gliders that are basically designed to race, which is anything above training level, all have canopies that if you just pull and release, the canopy just disappears. It's not an ejection seat or anything, but the canopy will just peel off the glider, and you loosen your seatbelt and you roll over the side of the glider and you pull your chute. In fact, in most competitions events, you're required to wear a parachute because of the proximity to other gliders and the probability that you could run into somebody. So all of the higher end gliders are all designed to literally make it as easy as possible to get out of the glider. And there have been situations where gliders have collided with other aircraft and their pilots have parachuted safely to the ground.
Do you need a current medical to fly gliders?
You do not. There's no medical required to fly glider.
And in fact, this is one of the situations where folks that might, like there's that part with flying a sport airplane, you have to have had, actually you don't have to have had a medical, you need to have a current driver's license, and then your medical could not have been denied, suspended, or revoked. But when it comes to gliders, it's just, but of course there's always 6153, I think is what it is, that is the reg that says that you can't fly with a no medical deficiency, like, that you're, for some reason you shouldn't be flying, but you don't need, you could have been, in this case, maybe in the past you were denied a medical, you can still fly gliders because there's no medical required at all.
The way I tell people to think about it is, what would the jury say?
Right. So you got to be responsible. Doesn't take all the responsibility away, but you're yeah.
Cool. So there's a definite advantage, is that you don't need a medical. But what other takeaways are there for a powered pilot to learn to soar?
What about your feet, Scott? The biggest, there's always that joke with glider pilots and pirate pilots and their feet.
Well, yeah, we often tease power pilots about having dead legs, and that we're going to introduce them to a flight control they may not be familiar with. And they say, well, what is that? We say it's called a rudder. With the long wings on the aircraft, it behaves differently than an airplane does, in that you get a lot more adverse drag on the wings. And so rudder is a much bigger part of flying a glider. In fact, I tell people the hardest part of flying the glider is keeping the yaw string, which is your turn coordinator, just keeping the yaw string straight.
That is so hard.
Yeah, I tell people the only time my yaw string is straight is when it's passing from right to left or vice versa.
And so the yaw string, what he's talking about too, is you saw that in some of the videos, but it's like literally a lot of times it's like cellophane tape with a piece of yarn or whatever there, and it's like the inclinometer, but it's opposite. Where you step on the ball, you actually pull the yaw. It works the opposite way of the ball, but it's the same idea.
Another thing that I experienced, and as an airplane pilot coming to gliders, is that I would often fly into my lessons in a high performance airplane. And I thought I was kind of God's gift to aviation. And I landed at the airport and I think, okay, I've got an afternoon. Let's get this glider rating out of the way. There's something that all power pilots go through when they realize that this thing is different. It flies differently. It's a different way of thinking about flying. They think it's going to be easy. It's not as easy as they think it is. So they kind of hit bottom, and then we bring them back up again. So it's
humbling in that part.
I went through it, and every airplane pilot I've ever trained went through it. Where how hard can this be, and then you find out. So just enjoy the experience, because it is amazing, and it'll make you a better airplane pilot.
So, and one thing I throw out there to kind of go along, because I had a similar experience. It's humbling. I'm still very humble about it, because I know that I'm nowhere near where I would ever want to be. But the thing that I learned too is the mechanical part of flying it. You're still going to know the controls. Like, that's very familiar. It's just like that sense, like flying an airplane. The weird parts where I remember freaking out because I soloed that first day. The next day I knew I had to make a bunch of solo flights because I was doing a commercial add-on. So I knew I needed 19 more solo flights. And my gosh, I think it was the first 5 flights I went up solo, I was freaking out. I'm like, what am I doing? Like, what what have I gotten myself into? There's no engine and I'm behind this tow plane and like, do I even know what the heck I'm doing? But then by the time I did it about 5 times, I remember getting to the point, I'm like, oh, as long as I get to the IP at the altitude Jan told me to be, and then I fly my pattern the way he showed me, it's gonna be fine. I've got plenty of altitude and room to work with. But the part that completely humbles me, every other pilot, glider pilot I've flown with too, is the soaring. It is like, I want to do it so bad. And that is something where it's like, you think, oh, how hard could it be? There is an art to that that I know has to be learned over time. It's amazing the way those guys can sniff that stuff out. So
when you were training, Chris, did you keep reaching? Were you reaching for the throttle to try to?
well, you have the brakes, and you don't keep your hand on the brake. I remember just keeping that. You would just check it, make sure that was locked in while you're flying. You're not going to use that. So no, I didn't find that too much. And maybe it's because I also started it, but you're more focused than you are in a powered airplane. In a powered airplane, you can kind of just get up there and start. You've probably done it, Dan. Just chill, right? You're in cruise, you're like whatever. You
just
don't
keep
do that
checking systems, right?
Thinking like, where's lift? Where's the airport? Where am I going?
Yeah.
How am I doing my coordination? I imagine that Scott tell us, but does that eventually go away as you get more experience? Because then for me, I was just hyper focused on trying to fly it well.
It becomes second nature.
Okay.
Everything just kind of goes into the subconscious, and you're just I describe it as mentally engaging, but not mentally exhausting.
Okay.
Your brain is always busy thinking about where am I, where do I want to be, how am I going to get there? And it's just a continuous, that's why your decision-making process gets so good, because if you're not making a decision every 20 seconds in a glider, you're getting behind the aircraft. So it's just a different, I often tell people that flying sailplanes compares to flying airplanes, like sailing compares to driving a motorboat. The vehicles appear similar, but the experience is entirely different.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And that way of thinking about flying, again, the fact that a glider category rating will make you a better airplane pilot, all of that way of thinking spills over into your airplane flying.
Mm-hmm.
After I got my glider category rating, I was working on getting my commercial in airplane so I could do the aerotow, and I was flying a Citabria. And when I would come back into the traffic pattern, I would enter the downwind and pull it to idle and leave it there. And I would fly the Citabria to the runway like it was a glider. And I was making accurately spot landings every time. I was reading an article recently where there's a guy who routinely 5, 6, 7, 10 miles from the airport will bring the aircraft to idle and make his way to the airport and enter the pattern and land just to be in the constant practice of knowing what his performance is in various situations, evaluating the situation as it occurs, changing the situation as he needs to. All of that kind of thing would pay huge dividends if it ever packed in, if the engine packed it in for real.
Mm-hmm. So with that, let's switch to the hybrid, to an electric motor glider. What is the endurance for the batteries?
Well, the electric motor is not there for cruising flight. It's there to one of two purposes. If it's a self-launching glider, it's designed to get you into the air to the point where you can hook a thermal, at which point you start using the thermal, you shut the motor down. So my glider had a 22 kilowatt motor and a 4.1 kilowatt hour battery. So if you ran the battery at full power, you had about 20 minutes and you fully exhausted the battery. I would typically take off on a day that was worth flying, meaning there were thermals. I could take off and within the first 4 minutes be high enough to hook a thermal. I would usually keep the motor running a little longer until the thermal was doing most of the work, and then I would shut down the motor. And I routinely didn't run the motor for more than 5 minutes, 4 minutes, sometimes 3 minutes. And I would have 80% of the battery capacity still available if I wanted to do what's called a retrieve, which means you've flown out beyond normal gliding distance of the airport. It's clear you're not going to get back. You can restart the motor and use that to get back. So the motors are really not designed for continuous cruising flying. There's not enough battery capacity to do that kind of thing. So they're designed for taking off, getting up to altitude, and then shutting them down and start flying just make the rest of the flight as a glider.
And that's kind of the difference I think you're getting at too. Maybe you could explain, you're talking about self-launch versus like a motor glider. which could be used. You could potentially use it for cruising,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, there are some gliders that literally have Rotax engines in them. We did have a slide in here that for something called a STEMI motor glider, which is an amazing aircraft. You can take off in it. This thing it has a Rotax, 100 horsepower Rotax engine in it that will allow you to cruise continuously at 135 knots. Or you can shut it down, clean it up, and have a 50-to-1 glide ratio. It's a glider. And it's yours for just a little over $250,000. At that price, you might as well get two, I always say. But yeah, so there are things called motor gliders where they're airplanes with long wings. You can fly them like airplanes, and they're kind of a compromise between a good airplane and a good glider. But you can do both with them. And then so I differentiate motor gliders from self-launching gliders. A self-launching glider is you intend to fly it pretty much mostly as a glider. A motor glider can be flown as an airplane or as a glider.
Okay.
Functionally.
You mentioned with thermals that you could look for a cloud as an indicator that there may be a thermal there. So I'm going to group this with another series of questions that came in. This question says, do you run out of lift when you get up to the cloud layer? And then that kind of leads into several questions that came through about, is gliding and soaring VFR only, or is there an IFR component to it? So do you run out of lift when you get to that cloud level, and then can you go in that cloud once you're there?
So we have to, gliders are typically being flown VFR. It is possible to fly them IFR. If you meet the requirements for IFR flight, which is, are you rated, are you equipped, and do you have a clearance? So I know of a glider pilot in Florida who routinely flies into the clouds with his glider. Does the lift stop at the bottom of the thermal? No, or at the bottom of the cloud? It does not. The reason that the cloud is as high as it is that the cloud is formed as the water in the cloud begins to condense out. And so the cloud begins to form at cloud base. But as the water condenses, it gives off heat, which then generates it makes the air more buoyant, and the cloud begins to continue to build. So there is literally lift to the top of the cloud. The problem is that you can't legally fly into a cloud. We in glider world have to follow the same cloud clearance requirements that airplane pilots do. So if we're in Class E airspace, it's 500 feet below, 1,000 feet above, 2,000 feet out the side is the requirement. So we can't go any closer to the cloud base legally than an airplane can. But the lift goes higher. It goes into the cloud and all the way to the top of the cloud. Although as it gets to the top of the cloud, it wouldn't be enough to actually support a glider. But if you have an instrument rating, and this guy in Florida does, he can continue into the cloud and gain more altitude than the rest of us can.
I imagine you must have an attitude indicator in there or something
You have to be properly equipped. You have to be properly certified, and you need a clearance to be doing that. Same as any airplane requirement for IFR.
By the way, let me take
there is no instrument rating in a glider. You have to get your instrument rating in another category of aircraft.
Right. So let me take a quick moment here, because I'll make my always fun plug for Robin Schauder's Private Pilot Handbook. When it comes to weather theory, literally what Scott was just talking about is in here. So check that out. But the other part is, Scott, what are some books too? Maybe they don't know. For free online, you can get the FAA's Glider Flying Handbook as a PDF. Just look up FAA Glider Flying Handbook. So if you're interested in learning more about this, check it out. Do you have any other recommendations too that you might say to people that for them to go look?
Yeah, anything that Bob Wander wrote. I think I'm.
How you spell his last name? Is it W-A-N-D-E-R?
Just like wandering, W-A-N-D-E-R.
Mm-hmm.
Anything that Bob Wander wrote. There's a couple of good books, training manuals out. Anything that Tom Knopf writes is pretty good stuff. And there's a gentleman named Russ Holtz. His site is gliderbooks.com. Has two very good books: the Flight Training Manual for Gliders and Aeronautical Knowledge for Gliders. Two probably very good materials. Those are the ones.
And you also mentioned there was a course too. The Sporties has a course for transitioning.
Well, Sporties has a really excellent DVD. I think it's called "So You Want to Fly Gliders." It is probably, and Bob Wander helped write and stars in it. it's probably the most concentrated and efficient introduction to flying gliders I've ever seen. They cover everything in an interesting. It's worth the money. If you're interested in flying gliders, I would highly recommend that you can get it as a DVD or a download or whatever else. But I think it's called So You Want to Fly Gliders. Used to be called, maybe it's called Introduction to Flying Gliders. Used to be called Transition to Gliders because it was targeted at people who are just getting the glider add-on category. Excellent resource. Yeah.
Speaking of transitions again, do you need to be current if you're a private pilot? Do you need to be current to transition to a glider?
I would think so, because during that training, you could end up, well, because during the training, you're effectively like a student pilot. Actually, that's a good question. How does that work for soloing if you're, let's say you're not current? Because obviously you could get a flight review as part of doing this or doing your check ride too. The instructor could sign you
So
off.
if we're talking about getting a category add-on, once you have a pilot certificate, you are never a student again. In order to solo an aircraft, what you get is an endorsement under a different part of the regulations that allows you to solo an aircraft for which you are not rated.
Okay, there it is.
It's an entirely different regulation from the student pilot regulation. So, yeah, when you're in order to fly the glider alone, you have to be certified under a different part of the regulations. But that's how it's done. Did that answer that part of the question?
Yep, absolutely.
I think so, yes.
Yep.
Actually, there was one other one that I wanted to throw out there too that I've always wondered, and while I've got you on, I wanted to ask. There are obviously the gliders you can do working towards your private, whatever it might be, but then there's also sport gliders. What is the difference between those? Because I would think most gliders fall under that 1,320 pounds that they do for the sport aircraft, at least currently.
Yeah, you'd be surprised. But so there are pilot certificates and there are category ratings.
Mm-hmm.
Pilot certificates basically equate to what I call your level of privilege. So when you get your first pilot certificate, it's typically private pilot, let's say airplane.
Mm-hmm.
There's really two pieces of information there. The private pilot says what it is you can do in the aircraft. You can fly it yourself and you can carry passengers. That's the limitation of private pilot. So it's your level of authority. And you're able to apply that level of authority in an airplane. You cannot apply that in a helicopter or a glider or any other category of aircraft until you get the category rating for the aircraft. So I sometimes compare it to getting your bachelor's degree.
Mm-hmm.
If you tell somebody you have a bachelor's degree, they say, well, what was your major? And you say, well, it was chemistry. Okay, so you have a bachelor's degree in chemistry, but that doesn't mean you know anything about physics. But if you went back and got a second major in physics, you wouldn't have another degree. You would simply have a single degree with multiple majors.
Gotcha. And that makes sense.
That's how pilot certification works. So you can get a sport pilot certificate, which gives you certain privileges and certain limitations. And then that level of privilege can be applied to various categories of aircraft.
Gotcha. So in other words, typically someone who's going to hold a private pilot certificate, they're going to do it. They're not going to add a sport glider on. They're going to add just a glider category rating onto their private pilot certificate.
Most likely, because there's almost no difference between the two, and the level of privilege is worth getting the entire the private. So there was a point in time when I was private pilot airplane commercial glider. I had commercial privileges in a glider, but I was limited to private pilots in an airplane.
Right.
Are you limited to 18,000 feet in a glider, or can you go higher?
So you can go higher, but there's a special condition. Typically, the reason you go 18,000 feet or higher is that you're flying in wave, which will easily take you to higher than 18,000 feet. Sometimes thermals will out west. But typically it's being done in a wave condition. And what you need to do in that circumstance is you need to establish a letter of agreement with the local air traffic control to create what's called a wave window, where they will literally take out a chunk of space above 18,000 feet, allow gliders to fly into it, and then we'll fly everything else around it. So they'll make sure that nothing's in that airspace with you. And so the local glider operation will contact air traffic control and say, we'd like to open the wave window during these times. And air traffic control will open that wave window, and then gliders are free to fly above 18,000 feet in that limited airspace. And air traffic control will route everything else that would normally go through that airspace around it so that it's not conflicting. Normally, you can't go above 18,000 feet because you need an instrument rating to be above 18,000 feet. And so for most of us, that pretty much eliminates going above 18,000. But you can go above 18,000 in a wave window.
And an interesting, like along that same theme too, like right here, the glider operation up here near Gettysburg has one for the TFR that's around Camp David. So sometimes they have permission to fly through that when other airplanes aren't.
Sure.
Again, they do the same thing.
Yep.
Well, that takes us to 1:30, guys.
This is cool, Scott.
Already.
Scott, thank you so much for doing this with us. I was just completely fascinated just listening to you as we were going through, and even I already knew what the presentation was going to be, yet I was still fascinated. So I'm hoping our audience found the same things. Don't forget, coming up in September 2023, 12 to 1 Eastern or 1600 Zulu or UTC, depending where you are. Check it out. We're going to talk about the DC CIFRA, so we hope you'll join us then. And if you're interested too, Scott does have another presentation where he talks more about how to apply glider concepts to flying powered airplanes. So if you're interested in that, just let us know as well. And we hope you will join us then. So everybody, thanks for being here. Appreciate you being here, Scott and Dan, as always. And Stephen, if you're still there, I assume. All right. Okay, guys. Well, we appreciate the audience being here as always, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks so much.